Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to episode 37 of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And today's guests are both heavily involved with Platform as a Service, so PaaS, but in really kind of different ways. So Dave McCrory, old friend of the show, is back. Dave's part of the Cloud Foundry team at VMware, and Adron Hall has recently made the jump from being an application developer in the financial services sector out in Portland to now leading and helping to drive what Tier 3 is doing in their recently announced PaaS platform. So Dave, Adron, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So we were talking a little bit before we started recording. You guys know each other. You've got some commonality in both what you're working on today, but also in your background. So tell us a little bit about what you're working on these days. Dave, go ahead and jump in first.
So we're doing quite a bit with the Cloud Foundry project, and then in addition, quite a bit with Tier 3, and that's because Tier 3 is leveraging Cloud Foundry for their platform. So the Cloud Foundry ecosystem's really kind of taken off, and Tier 3 has been one of the leaders as far as taking advantage of the great things that Cloud Foundry as an ecosystem has to offer.
Very cool. So, Adron, I kind of, like a lot of times what we end up doing on the show, we get to know people sort of through Twitter and through their blogs before we ever kind of get to know them face to face. I found out about the stuff that you were doing through a really cool series of blog posts that you wrote over on, I believe it was New Relic's website, but it was sort of a 4 or 5 part series on getting started with Cloud Foundry, kind of going from some of the previous development you were doing to sort of this new model. So tell us kind of where you were, what you're doing these days, and what's sort of cool in your world.
Well, so a while back I was working, like you mentioned, in the financial sector, and one of the things that the financial sector generally has is a somewhat slow deployment process. And I'm always looking for ways to improve whatever it might be that I'm doing. And in this particular situation, I was looking at ways to improve the deployment process and kind of stumbled into PaaS technology. And since I had a lot of cloud technology background, it was very easy for me to just kind of slide in there and start working with PaaS technologies. And I had started a conversation a while back with New Relic, and they asked if I'd be interested in doing a series about PaaS technology. And of course I said yes, and I looked at the thing that really had my attention at the time was Cloud Foundry. So I did what actually ended up being it was a 5 part series that ended up with 6 parts. There's like a 3.1 and a 3.15, it's pi part of the series. And basically it's just kind of a full view of PaaS technologies, what you do with it, what you deploy to it, how it simplifies life. So that's kind of how I leapt into PaaS technology. And then just to catch up to where I'm at now, I started around that time talking to Tier 3 about some of the things that at the time, were kind of top secret efforts. And they asked if I'd come in and help them work up their web fabric, which is of course built around Cloud Foundry, and the Iron Foundry project, which is .NET extensions for Cloud Foundry, so that we have a full framework spectrum supported.
Yep.
So that's where I'm at right now, and that's how I fell into the PaaS universe.
Very cool. So Dave, let's sort of take a step back for a second. You were on here probably 6 months or so ago, before last year's VMworld, and Cloud Foundry was, 3 or 4 months old. People were still trying to figure it out. You guys were doing really basic seminars and sessions, and micro Cloud Foundry had just come out. We're now up to about the 1 year anniversary. Big sort of not so much a relaunch, but sort of reaffirming that VMware's committed to the communities. VMware's still completely committed to it being open source. Talk about some of the cool stuff that you guys came out with for that sort of first anniversary, stuff like Bosch and some of the other things that are really happening now in year 2.
Sure. So in year 2, we introduced a couple of new components, and part of it was making Cloud Foundry a little bit more scalable. So there are a few components we added. One is called UAA, which is an authentication component to Cloud Foundry. That allows for things like OAuth and such. That's in the code base right now, and I think it's going to be going, if it isn't live on .com, it will be very soon. Another thing that we did was we broke out a component called the Stager to allow for better scaling of some of the other Cloud Foundry components. And then on top of that, we also added a couple of extensions to the VMC client. So that has several new capabilities as far as detecting additional frameworks and allowing you to do some new things such as tunneling to services. So you can actually hook up traditional tools and attach to the databases that are deployed in Cloud Foundry through the tunneling capability. In addition to that, we introduced the concept of containers for what we call DEAs, so that's where the actual applications are executed. Those containers actually allow you to run standalone applications as well now, which is another new capability that we didn't have. So previously you could only run web applications, and the system would look to see if your application was attempting to listen on the correct port, and if you did not have something listening on that port, Cloud Foundry would kill the app. It does not do that if you're using the standalone option now. So that was a big bundle of features that we've come out with for Cloud Foundry, the core, and then past that we introduced, as you mentioned, Bosch. Bosch being a tool that allows you to manage Cloud Foundry at a production level at scale. So before this, we had some shell scripts that would allow you to do small deployments, and we also had some chef scripts. While the chef scripts give you the flexibility, they don't give you as much repeatability of ensuring you're laying down the same Cloud Foundry bits that you were before. Chef in and of itself doesn't have the concept of versions of something being deployed, and it's also not designed to offer as close to 100% availability as possible. So we actually use Bosch to run CloudFoundry.com, the service,
okay.
And we experience very little to no downtime in the operations of the .com site itself, and that includes updating it on average twice a week. So we will update the entire service where everyone's applications are running, and they don't experience any interruption, even though we've literally upgraded major components of the Cloud Foundry infrastructure itself. No downtime experience to the apps.
Okay, and that's really, I mean, kind of all this learning from the last year is really getting to the point where, I mean, you've got to be able to do that. You've got to be able to have those services so that when Tier 3 or anybody else who's trying to, run those services, they've got to be able to deploy as changes are needed. They've got to be able to add new capacity, add new apps without sort of any hiccups throughout the process. So that's very, very cool. So it sounds like. Go ahead.
Well, and there's one important thing that has happened as well since we last spoke was the addition of .NET support from Tier 3 and another company called Uhuru, providing actual .NET runtime support for Cloud Foundry. So Tier 3 has the Iron Foundry project, which makes it possible to run an instance of Cloud Foundry on your own, or leveraging Tier 3 service and run .NET-based apps as well, which is pretty awesome in my opinion.
Right, so you've pretty much got all the major sort of frameworks at this point. You've got Java, you've got Ruby, you've got Python, you've got Node, now you've got .NET, and it sounds like you guys are. You're starting to branch out in a little bit different directions. You've got some things addressing the, how much visibility do I have inside the machine through some of the stuff, the tunneling you were talking about. Plus, you've got some ability for people to these standalone apps that you're doing. They've got some ability to kind of stick your toes in the water, but not be 100% in. And so you're addressing a lot of the ways for people to start getting engaged around Cloud Foundry, around PaaS platforms. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And also, they're working from those avenues with Cloud Foundry. And at Tier 3, one of the things that we've done just to make it really simple is we provide the IaaS directly beside the PaaS solution. So you can literally, when we have a web fabric deployed, which a customer would just, they go into the interface and they say, all right, we're going to use PaaS now. They can literally go in with a few form fields filled out, click create, and then a short period after that, they'll have their own web fabric, which is a fully rolled Cloud Foundry environment with Iron Foundry, so that you have the entire spectrum of frameworks and database resources that you need. But then right beside that, you have our infrastructure at Tier 3, which is just your standard operating systems. And then, if you're using SQL Server or PostgreSQL, whatever it may be, it's a very, very traditionally familiar environment. So you can run things side by side. And that kind of gives an extra stepping stone to getting into PaaS without, jumping all the way in, kind of like you said.
Okay. So you guys will offer people to sort of what would be traditional VM type of IaaS services, and then as well, sort of through the same set of tools, the same set of similar set of tools and monitoring. And okay, so very, very cool. So again, a lot of this is about how do people get started with it? How do you make them feel comfortable with it? How do you help them deal with the fact that most of them aren't complete greenfields and want to figure out how to migrate at whatever pace they want? So, Adrian, let's talk about. I'm kind of curious because, like you said, you were kind of as a developer, you're always kind of looking to go faster. You've got sort of background in a couple of different frameworks and languages. Talk about kind of what your journey was in evaluating the PaaS platforms, in starting to write some code and deploy to it. What's how much different is it from, say, what you were used to traditionally for people that are kind of thinking about kicking the tires? They've been hearing about different PaaS platforms. What's it like from a developer's perspective?
Well, one of the things that always comes up to me whenever I'm thinking about it, I always think very lean, agile mentality. Mm-hmm. So when I started playing with PaaS technologies, I realized that instead of just iterating, like I would deploy code almost as frequently as I would commit code to a repository. And because of that, it moves the development process along much faster because you always know exactly what is or is not working. Mm-hmm. In a traditional environment, you usually have various stages. And this is reduced over the years more and more, but you have a stage where you throw something over the wall and you kind of cross your fingers and hope it works. Traditionally, a lot of people are very familiar with the throw it over the wall to QA. Well, even within just the core development process, as you work by yourself or with a pair programming or something like that, there's that certain stage. And with PaaS, almost all of the, throw it over there, let's see if it's going to work. Usually you just know because you can do a push, it takes a few seconds, and there it is, it's working. Or it's not working, and then you go and work to resolve, whatever issue has come up. But that's the biggest thing with PaaS is it gives you that immediate feedback of I know what I'm doing right now is working and continuing to work. Okay. And that's a huge thing for a developer. A developer usually doesn't get that type of immediate production level feedback. Okay.
So that's you can sort of plan what you've got to. I mean, I guess if you're a non-developer, maybe like a simple analogy would be like if you've got multiple people working on a Google Doc and you can see changes being made in real time. You can kind of get feedback. You can get a sense. Did it work? Exactly. Did it not work? And okay, very, very good.
I've actually done coding with people doing that same thing, and you'd be surprised at actually how quickly you can solve problems with that type of paired programming model.
I was going to give you a quick analogy with that too, and that paired programming model with Google Docs, I've done that too. Like in meetups and things. It's ridiculously effective, very, very, very effective to have something like that. But the analogy I was going to give you is it's literally stepping up to PaaS and using that for your development is the difference between, like the comparison you did with the Google Doc and having all those edits in real time and literally mailing a diskette back and forth the old way. I mean, it seems that night and day once you start using it. It's really great.
Okay. So, so Dave, you've got pretty good visibility of kind of a lot of the PaaS market. Obviously, there's, Cloud Foundry's got a number of partners / platforms, Tier 3 being one. There's a number of others. There's probably almost a half dozen or so. Plus, there's some other folks in the market, the Engine Yards and Salesforce and so forth that are doing this. We're a couple of years, a year to a couple of years into this space. People are wrapping their heads around it, different approaches to dealing with it. What are we still missing? I mean, beyond just getting better at operationalizing it and making sure we don't have downtime, what are you guys hearing as sort of the big, maybe the big things that are missing, or the big areas that people feel like, okay, we've covered enough of that, we really got to go solve this next big problem?
My view is we're still a long ways off from the average enterprise fully understanding what platform as a service is, and being able to leverage and write software to truly leverage platform as a service. I think most enterprises that you see are going to fall back on the classic 3-tier application model. I have a database, an app server, and a web server. I might put them all on a single machine, or I might break them out into the separate tiers and go with that. And that's not really how people that understand and are able to really leverage cloud. That's not what they're doing. I think one of the problems today is that most enterprises believe that cloud is all about how do I automate the deployment of my virtual machines. Mm-hmm. And while that's valuable, what PaaS brings and what the extensions to PaaS bring are huge. The problem is you have to be able to write code and understand what capabilities it brings to be able to leverage it. And I think there are very few people today that can do that.
Okay. And when you say people that know how to leverage it, I mean, obviously one of the, we'll sort of stick with Cloud Foundry. I mean, one of the things that's always talked about is it supports Spring as a Java framework. It supports Rails. It supports, Node. I mean, some of those are pretty well known. People write in those frameworks today. How much, you're a big time Ruby developer. Adron's got .NET background. I mean, how much different from what you used to develop into sort of this new model? How big is that learning curve? Is it really just sitting down with somebody who can kind of help you understand it, or is it a fairly big thing? You've got to really immerse yourself in this.
I think it's understanding that you're writing applications that are distributed applications, okay. and so there are some fundamental differences. It doesn't mean that every app you write has to be entirely different than that classic model I spoke about, but mm-hmm. understanding how apps behave in these distributed environments gives you a leg up when you're trying to code your app to optimally take advantage of the platform you're running on.
Okay.
You can deploy a classic 3-tier app on Tier 3 or on Cloud Foundry or on, I guess you could deploy it on some of the others. Some of the platforms as a service, there's no way you could easily do that. What's more, I think that you're gonna see that the people that take full advantage of this distributed platform that I keep talking about and writing to the design patterns. So using messaging, for example, using what people used to call service-oriented architecture as far as some of those design patterns. Mm-hmm. Those are the companies that benefit big. The canonical example would be Netflix, who runs all of their apps up on Amazon.
Right.
they do that without incurring downtime and such, but that's because they fully understand how to write apps on top of bare cloud infrastructure. So writing apps on PaaS is hard. Writing everything on bare infrastructure is even harder.
Sure. Right, and that basically comes down to all of those services that you might need, whether they're queuing or messaging or load balancing or whatever. I mean, you almost have to do it yourself, whereas the PaaS platforms at least have some level of those types of things built in, some level of feedback to help you know when to scale up, scale down. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one of the beauties of PaaS too, because like Dave says, there are indeed a lot of things. I mean, it's a shifting paradigm in the way to develop applications. I almost chuckled out loud to myself a second ago because I was thinking, deploying a 3-tier application to a PaaS or to the cloud is kind of like, you could drive your airplane down the road, but it would be better if you flew the airplane.
Right.
So that's kind of the paradigm shift. I mean, you need to use the tool and the capabilities of that device. Once you're up in the air, you're going 450 miles an hour or something, and it's not an issue. You're just going wherever you're going. Okay. Same thing with PaaS and cloud technology. Once you start distributing things out and you start building that way, you start moving a lot faster and you get a lot more capabilities for less overhead cost, and you just start moving faster.
Okay. So talk for a second, Adron. Talk for a second about Tier 3 in particular. So you guys have an IaaS offering. You've now got a PaaS offering. How do you, when you're out talking to customers, your teams are out sort of trying to persuade customers to come and leverage your services. What's a typical engagement? I mean, how much is it education? How much do you help them get the first couple of applications running, or is it just here's our environment, we're making sure it's always available? What's a typical engagement with a customer from any industry?
Yeah, well, I'm going to speak from Tier 3 perspective and
Sure.
just people that I've talked to myself that I have contact with in places. But with the context, too, that I'm still pretty heads down in code a lot of the time.
Sure.
Generally, whenever I approach any company that's just thinking about this or even fortunately knows what PaaS technology is, the first thing I do is just sit down and kind of say, all right, what are you guys doing now in your environment? Like, how is it set up? And we kind of take a look at that and then figure out like what would be the best approach so that they can start getting small little pieces of advantage to using it. Usually with most enterprises, the first thing is cleaning up the deployment process, because all of a sudden you've simplified the environments that they need. And especially like if they're using a Tier 3 environment, they can literally spool up 2-3 completely duplicate web fabrics and then have one as development or whatever they need. That way they can meet whatever regulatory burdens they have as a large enterprise, and they can just start moving the development process smoothly across that. But the key seems to be getting into the company and just getting the basic understanding around what PaaS is, and then the little small pieces that it can help with, which is, like I said, usually the deployment scenario. A lot of enterprises too, they'll have hundreds and hundreds of small applications that they built.
Right.
Sometimes it's just a database and an app or whatever it is. And if they look at those, a lot of the time, some of those, even though they're a year, 2, 3, 5, 6 years old, they can move those into a PaaS very easily. And all of a sudden, everything is managed through that environment, and it kind of disconnects them from needing to manage individual instances, server operating systems, things like that. And I refer to that as removing the operating system barrier. So that's probably the second biggest thing that comes is just finding out a way to say, hey, look, here's how you can reduce the headache of dealing with all the operating systems and all those things that are underneath.
Okay. So I think I'm hearing from you guys that there's still a fairly big sort of learning curve and sort of an education opportunity, but also an education sort of challenge of just getting people. How do you think about these things in new ways? How do you think about what the differences are going to be, and then like you were saying, find those sort of early lighthouse applications or those early things that you can sort of get going and then point to, see how much easier that was, see how much operationally faster that was, see how much you can iterate without having to, have 10 meetings. You can have 10 pushes of code. Very cool. Let's shift gears a little bit. So we talked a lot about sort of the platforms and getting people engaged with the platforms. Dave, you're starting to get kind of famous about this concept you have about when people do start deploying the platforms, they deploy these applications, they start collecting data around their applications, and you're sort of calling this phenomenon data gravity, about the weight that goes with and the actions that go with where your data is and why it's really important to think about where it is. Can you talk about that a little bit, kind of the origin of your thinking and then where you've evolved it to over the last 6-9 months?
Sure. So I had the conceptually in December of 2010, I had the thought that data seems to have a gravitational effect, and I blogged about that. The best way I can describe it is, usually you have a reason why you're writing an application, and either you're writing your application to leverage some existing data, or you're writing an application with the intent that it's going to create or combine data. Mm-hmm. And so when you do that, you begin with a mass of data. It may be a very small massive data, but over time the amount of data increases. Whether it's a customer order system and you accumulate orders over time, whether it's a CRM system, whether it's a front end for store inventory, or some internal human resources app, or anything else, you begin accumulating more data. This becomes especially true of internet applications, so things that people deploy on the internet. When the data set becomes active enough, or enough data grows, if it's made available to other people, they will usually also write applications, and those applications will leverage that data, and they will create more data. And so you end up with this gravitational effect where people end up wanting to put their applications as close to the data as they can, because applications that are closer to the data have lower latency and higher bandwidth access to the data. So if you run an application on the same machine where the data is, it has very, very fast access to the data. If you run the application in London and the data lives in New York, then you're not going to have as fast an access, and you're going to have around a 60 millisecond latency, no matter what you do. Go ahead.
So this is, some of it seems sort of, just sort of logical, right? The closer you are to the information, but I think what you're getting at is sort of a different phenomenon that we used to have with sort of walled garden types of services, an AOL or a iCloud, or where it was like, if your information was there, you could never get it out. You're really talking about people accessing applications via APIs. You're talking about constant updates of data because of sensors or location, or you're talking about a much different way of interacting with the data, and hence thinking about where it physically resides is really important, but also who's accessing it, how they're accessing it. Is that?
That's right, and conceptually, for the most part, people aren't truly locked in. There's just the concept. There are two concepts. One is the idea that if you constantly are updating the data, you have to be able to pull the data out faster than you're updating it, or it's impossible to pull away from the gravitational effect. So that would be escape velocity. So that would be one way that you would have to deal with being what people would call locked in, but effectively that's what it is. The other thing would be how reliant your application is on the speed and bandwidth it has to that data. So once you move an application closer to the data, it becomes increasingly difficult to move it further away again. So that's another effect of the gravity. And finally, the last thing is as you begin to rely on specific APIs for accessing the data or for creating additional data, that creates friction in you being able to move away from that data. So those are really the things that encompass what at least what today lock-in is all about in clouds, and for that matter, even if you're moving data sets around in big data or something like that. So far, the analogy is held up very well when describing all of these different scenarios versus what actually happens.
Right. And Adron, I saw you had a tweet earlier today where you were talking about, you haven't really dug into this concept all that much, but you were sort of indirectly kind of feeling the effects of data gravity. Can you talk a little about what you were kind of hinting at or what you were getting at?
I don't recall exactly what that tweet was about, but I run into those experiences on a regular basis. I've worked, as we mentioned, in the financial industry a lot, and the gravity in those institutions is very, very apparent once you're in there. I mean, there's the context of how close you are to the data. Literally, they have it gets talked about every once in a while where financial trades are actually in a competitive distance race to make sure that the speed of light isn't too slow or whatnot. Those things come up, and then just the fact that there's data in so many little places that you even have conflicting gravity spheres where you're like, well, I have this data over here and I have this data over here and I need it together, but I can't put it together, and there's conflicts, and if you put it too close, it gets your data gets corrupted and you can't merge it, just all sorts of little things. And the analogy really does work really, really well on just many, many levels.
Yeah, I was thinking about it a little bit this week. I was down. I mean, this is sort of off topic for PaaS, but I was down at the SAP Sapphire conference, and one of the big things they announced is this idea of this platform they call HANA, which is all about in-memory databases, and they were talking about you'll no longer need disks. Everything will run in memory, and you start thinking about that, and you go, okay, I understand that there's obviously some cost and economics involved with that, but we now have, huge in-memory databases, whether they're, the times 10s or the HANAs. You've got things like Hadoop, which can chop stuff up and do batch processing really, really, really well. You've got SSD, you've got Flash from a storage perspective. We're almost coming back to this cyclical thing again where, the network and being able to move information quickly is going to become very, very quickly a big bottleneck. Mm-hmm. And then you can layer on top of that, I think, and Dave, correct me if I'm going in the wrong place here, but when you start getting into cloud, especially public cloud, and you have to think about things like physically which country does my data reside in, you could probably get into some complicated things from an application developer's perspective of where are my users coming from, especially if you're developing a global application or even a regional application, and how do I tie into things like CDNs? How do I replicate the data? How do I keep things in sync? And it starts getting kind of complicated, I would think.
Well, or can you replicate the data? One thing I'm always curious about is I think if people looked at some of the different laws, you might not be able to replicate the data in the CDN, and that might be the only way you can viably have an application work. So you might actually be at conflict with what you need to do. I think it's also interesting. You pointed out the in-memory databases. That's something that there are a whole lot of companies taking different approaches to be able to leverage in-memory. The I guess ironic thing is once you start using an application that's using an in-memory database, that has an incredibly strong potential for gravity for data gravity, because you're actually interacting with data that's being stored primarily in memory. So you have a far higher request and bandwidth capability in that than you would if, say, you were running over a WAN link or something like that. Mm-hmm. That means that your application will behave differently. You would want to build your application to behave differently. And as Adron was talking about, in the financial industry, people want to get as close to the source that's emitting the trade data as they can, because if you have a nanosecond advantage over the other traders, it can mean the difference of hundreds of millions of dollars. That's another example of what the motivators are behind being able to leverage data gravity.
Right. Yeah, and I think we were supposed to have Sam Johnson on the show last week, and we had some scheduling issues. But that was one of the things I wanted to bring up with him, is he's working at Equinox, and Equinox keeps introducing more and more ways for whether that's you as a customer to get closer to Ethernet fiber runs, direct, locate your co-location facilities in their data centers, which are closer to the POPs and the big internet POPs. They're talking about services where customers within the same data centers can do some pretty unique things together. So yeah, I think that'll become a bigger deal, especially as we see, like you said, certain industries where it's literally milliseconds are deciding whether or not you win or lose that day, or people trying to do find oil, find energy, find information like that is going to be pretty important. So very cool.
Agreed. I will throw out there, no matter how fat those pipes are, you still have the speed of light issue. So if you're too far away, you can have infinite bandwidth, but it's still going to take an amount of time to get to you.
Right. So last topic, and we'll sort of leave this one sort of a little bit open-ended, and we'll wrap up the show. So you guys were both at Interop last week. Interop's become kind of an interesting show. It's all over the place. It's networking. It's mobile. There was a enterprise cloud summit that Alistair Kroll ran. What was interesting to you at that show last week? What any topics, any discussions kind of jump out at you as being interesting, controversial stuff that you're going to go follow up on?
For me, I spent a fair amount of time on the big data track. It was kind of intriguing looking at some of the different work that was going on, especially by Google with their BigQuery. That was something that was pretty impressive, seeing what they were doing with a 6 gigabyte data set that they were literally manipulating in what I would say was near real time, and it was unstructured data from what I could tell. It was pretty impressive. There were some other interesting technologies that I got some exposure to. I think the most interesting thing was the number of enterprises that are starting to explore big data stuff, and the seemingly large number of people that wanted to call almost anything cloud. That really stuck out in my head.
Yeah.
Everything had cloud. Network switches that were cloud switches, and I'm going, what difference is this network switch from the one over there that makes it a cloud switch? But apparently it's now cloud.
Yeah, so cloud washing in full effect.
Yes.
Yeah. That I have to admit, I saw that a lot at Interop, and I've seen it a lot other places. Just like Ellison at Oracle said, I think it was 2 years ago, he thought this cloud thing was a bunch of junk, but he was still going to put cloud whatever in front of everything that Oracle makes, and that's kind of what everybody's doing these days. Is it doesn't have to be even remotely related to the original precepts of kind of what people were trying to do that fell under the cloud premise. So you literally have cloud desktop and a cloud mouse and a cloud keyboard and a cloud screen, and everything's just cloud.
Yeah.
So that's a little nuts, but that's what the industry does, I suppose.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I think a lot of that stuff gets driven not so much for the technologist, but because the business guy in the room goes, well, wait a second, this all sounds interesting, but I'm trying to do cloud, whatever that means for him over here. So we better be buying this cloud and that cloud, and they in somebody's mind they all sort of have to line up, or at least hope they line up. So that's the joys of this technology moving really fast.
Yeah, and it's one of those double-edged sword things too, where all of a sudden people are getting more acclimated to the word. Mm-hmm. So they think they want this cloud thing or that cloud thing, but still, even though they seem more open to the idea, when like I get into a situation where I need to educate on whatever piece of technology, it actually makes it a little bit harder. So people are more likely to talk to you about cloud technology, but then explaining it and having to kind of back up and explain that, well, all this, okay, let's forget cloud for a minute and let's talk about what the individual pieces of what we're really talking about. Yeah. So it's like it introduces conversations, but then it makes the conversations more difficult.
Okay, I hear you. Well, good. Well, guys, we are getting sort of towards the end of our time slot. Real quick, we're kind of in the middle of trade show season. Dave, I think you mentioned to me earlier you're going off to GlueCon next week. Where are you guys going to be for the next couple of months, couple of weeks worth of places where people might run into you, places where people might find you if they want to talk about some of the topics we had tonight?
Well, I will be, as you said, next week I will be at GlueCon. The following week I'll be in the Bay Area for the majority of the week. I'm also on schedule to be at both VMworld, and also I was just invited to give a data gravity talk at Cloud Connect in Chicago in September.
Very cool. Adron, I see you being very, very active in kind of the Portland scene, a lot of the cloud camps. Where else might people run into you?
Well, I will be at the Portland Code Camp, the Seattle Code Camp. I'll also be at OS Bridge and OSCON, which are two conferences coming up. I will also be at DeployCon in New York, which I think is in June-ish timeframe. I'm forgetting my dates now.
Right, yeah, that's Krish's PaaS Summit. That's cool.
Yeah, so I'll be up there. And I know I'll have some more getting lined up here real soon. So that's basically my next 2 months are those events.
Very cool. Well, you are the second person from Portland we've had on the show in about the last month. So there's some very cool things happening there. I'll throw out a little teaser to folks who are listening. There's another cool announcement coming next week from some folks in Portland. So keep your ears open. A lot of good things going on out there. Guys, thanks so much again for the time tonight. For everybody else, we're out of time. You can follow us on Twitter at thecloudcast.net or reach us on the web, obviously, at thecloudcast.net. Links to the show, our YouTube channel, and as well, you can find the show on Stitcher or iTunes. So for Dave, for Adron, for everybody, thanks for listening, and folks, have a good night.